Chapter 25. It is not my purpose to discuss and displace the questions whether those two acts were lawful or not, or even to inquire whether many European states have not lost their glory and renown in consequence of similar acts backed by the power of physical force. I will only relate what I have either personally witnessed or ascertained to be true. I might, however, point out that when Louis XIV undertook to place his grandson on the throne of Spain, he had no other right than the terror which he inspired, and the means which he had at command for enforcing a will wrung from Charles II by the threats and artifices of the Duke of Harcourt. The King of Spain only decided in favor of the Duke of Anjou in preference of the Archduke Charles of Austria in order to avoid the dismembering of Spain and the partition of his states. Questions successfully agitated by Louis XIV with the King of England, the States of Holland, and the Emperor of Germany. The Duke of Anjou was acknowledged King of Spain by France and her allies, but the Emperor Napoleon was possessed of a moral and physical power far greater than what Louis XIV wielded at that particular period. It is certainly true that Charles II disinherited no one, and that a part of the Spanish nation declared for the Duke of Anjou. Austria, however, raised contrary pretensions which she asserted by force of arms, and another part of the Spanish nation pronounced itself in her favor. The legality of the pretenders' claims was therefore discussed on the field of battle. That long war was a doubtful issue, and Philip V was frequently compelled to quit Madrid. Had not the death of the Emperor of Germany happened opportunely for calling away the Archduke Charles to fill the imperial throne, and thereby released from their obligation that part of the Spanish people which had risen in his favor, or if that Archduke had met with success instead of failure, what would then have become of the will of Charles II? Unquestionably, the Archduke Charles would have reigned over Spain, and notwithstanding the will of Charles II, he would have brought that throne to the House of Austria, which would thus have become the lawful inheritor of the sovereignty of Spain and of the Indies, as Charles V had been. And Louis XIV would have been arraigned as an ambitious man, a usurper, etc., and assailed with abuse for all the intrigues which were no doubt resorted to for the purpose of dictating the will of Charles II. Legitimacy, therefore, sprung out of no other source than victory. What inference are we to draw from the occurrence having been otherwise accepted that the success of Louis XIV was owing to a death which spared him the necessity of erecting from the port of Sète in Languedoc and from Perpignan to Bayonne a line of fortresses such as those he was constructing in Flanders, a death which put him in a more favorable position than that in which Francis I had been placed. The case of necessity was as clearly made out for France on the present occasion. The throne of Spain was in no danger of falling to the lot of the House of Austria, but that of France might be transferred to Spain, the throne of which was held by a family with which there was much less likelihood of any accommodation than was the case as between France and Austria. It must indeed be admitted that there were heirs of that family. This was the difficulty, but it was proper for the sake of private interest to endanger the harmony which bound both nations to each other when a similar consideration had influenced a century before the determination taken by Charles II to transfer his inheritance to the French House of Bourbon. He was not induced to do so by any affection for that house or any conviction of her rights to the succession, but merely out of regard for his subjects, to whom he was unwilling to leave as a dying bequest a perpetual war with France, which would have always maintained an ascendancy over her. Perhaps also he was persuaded that by destroying each other they would have promoted the cause of their enemies. That prudent monarch was no doubt well aware that sovereigns are generally much less inclined to sacrifice their personal feelings to the welfare of their subjects than they are to resort to those subjects for the physical power they stand in need of to gratify their revenge and promote their private resentment. Nevertheless, the emperor felt the insecurity of the two titles which placed Spain at his command. He plainly saw that their only effect was to render the throne vacant, and the very circumstance of his having assumed the crown of France by the consent of the nation made him desirous to consult the Spanish nation in the choice of the monarch, whom he intended as a successor to the princes of the House of Bourbon. This is another of those occasions on which he was ill-seconded, and in which Monsieur de Talleyrand might have been of essential service to him. The emperor, who attended personally to everything, sent immediately a courier to his brother, the King of Naples, desiring him to repair forthwith to Bayonne, and he transmitted orders to Spain at the same time, directing that a deputation of the most influential men of each province and government, whether of the clergy or in civil or military capacities, should be sent to Bayonne. His object was to form them into a junta, before which he would have candidly stated what were the political considerations which compelled him to meddle in their domestic affairs. He was desirous of enlightening the Spaniards through their medium and of removing from their minds the impression that he intended to conquer Spain. He wished, on the contrary, to demonstrate to them that their future safety would be much better secured under a monarch whose first personal interest would be to repel all perfidious advice, the tendency of which might be to separate the interests of Spain from those of France, because the first consequence of it for the monarch would be the loss of his throne, as he would infallibly fall a sacrifice to the very intrigue which might have succeeded in deceiving him. The emperor's only aim was to bind Spain to France by uniform principles of government and uniformity of interests. Geographically speaking, that country is a continuation of the French soil. It communicates with no other and is terminated by the Pillars of Hercules. In a word, there are no more Pyrenees. Its immense extent of coast renders it vulnerable on that side, a prey to England under a bad administration, and formidable under a good one. Under the system of the emperor, as well as at any other time, it was for the interests of France that Spain should be placed on a par with her in respect to civilization, that she should receive such institutions as would bind her fate in ours, and that the canker which undermines her should be forever rooted up from her soil. The emperor's conduct was, in this point of view, not only noble and praiseworthy, but characteristic also of the soundest policy. The whole error was in the informality of the act. The issue of the event was too rapidly accelerated without sufficient regard being paid to the national feelings. Had Charles IV and his son concurred in this gigantic project, he would have availed himself of their aid for their purpose of softening down the difficulties. But independently of the disfavor in which they were held, owing to the state of destitution to which Spain was reduced, he discovered on his first interview with them how little they could assist him, and felt besides that none but a man connected with himself by the ties of affinity or of martial renown was calculated to give effect to any plan that might obtain the assent of all enlightened Spaniards and even the nobility of Spain. The emperor little expected to find spread over the whole nation a swarm of monks, all powerful by their connection with every family, for there was not a family to be found in any class of people which had not some member of it, either a priest or a monk, who acted as the mentor and sovereign ruler of their opinions. They are all perfectly ignorant and uneducated, and their vices and defects are the means by which they insinuate themselves with the population, and they can do so much more effectually than our priests, who have all studied to a certain extent, and are subjected to a kind of discipline which does not exist in Spain, as a restraint upon that low, intolerant, and superstitious set of men, the inveterate enemy of every improvement. To them is to be ascribed the exasperated feelings of the Spaniards. They had but to pronounce the watchword in order to raise to its highest pitch the opposition of the people to that order of things which was about to effect the destruction of whatever promoted idleness and its attendant enjoyments. They alone, by exciting the fanaticism of the people, defeated the emperor's projects. The Spaniards, who were the least carried away by this influence, discovered at once that the struggle was in vain, despairing of our success, and well aware of the ascendancy of the monks. They deserted our cause and eventually followed the stream. African blood still runs in the veins of the Spaniards, who are, as it were, separated from Europeans. Their connection with us would have remodeled their character and manners, completed their civilization, and therefore accomplished the ruin of England. That power, however, is acknowledged to possess the talent of skillfully wielding every element of discord. The emperor was desirous, in short, of pressing upon the junta the necessity for Spain adopting liberal principles in order to place her in harmony, not only with France, but with the other powers of Europe, from which she still remained at an immeasurable distance. His junta was to bring King Joseph back to Spain after taking cognizance of all that had occurred between the emperor and Charles IV at Bayonne. Independently of that measure, the courts of the kingdom were to be assembled at Madrid and to proceed to the constitutional election of the new king. That election would have been no matter of doubt. The foundation was already laid for King Joseph by the fame which his personal qualities had secured for him, and the excellent administration he had established in the kingdom of Naples. And as he was, moreover, the bearer of those constitutional improvements which had been so much wished for by the Spanish people, he would soon have obtained their affection and support. I am now about to relate the circumstances owing to which these intentions were defeated. A few days after the breaking out of the insurrection at Madrid, a similar feeling of discontent manifested itself in Valencia, Cadiz, Andalusia, Aragon, Extremadura, and Santander. On the coast of Biscay, the orders of Prince Ferdinand had reached all those points where the blind fanaticism of the priests and the nobility created a general rising. The emperor little expected that matters would have taken this turn. I have already mentioned that he had but few troops in Spain, which were much less adapted for military movements from the insufficiency of their numbers and to support the party that would have undoubtedly declared for us. If the enterprise had been better managed and accidents had not happened, which it was impossible to foresee, although it was found necessary to send our scanty forces to the points which, by their importance and populations, exercise an influence over a great extent of the country. Those expeditions were not only unavailing, but the disturbed districts sent no deputies to Bayonne. Time was running on without any improvement of our affairs. Deputies came from those parts only of which we held possession. This was, however, some point gained, since they amounted to 120 members, including the Spaniards who had accompanied Charles IV and the two infants. The opinion of this assembly might be expected to have had some weight, and yet it will be seen how every measure was defeated in its progress. In order to avoid all embarrassments and unpleasant scenes that would have daily taken place on the arrival of those deputies at Bayonne, the emperor hastened to terminate whatever related to King Charles IV and the infants. The king was to first take his departure for Compiègne, a residence which he selected in preference to others, it having been greatly extolled to him on account of its field sports, which he passionately delighted in. The Infants afterwards departed for Valence. The abrupt termination of these affairs having taken the emperor by surprise, he was at a loss to fix upon a residence for them. He asked Monsieur de Talleyrand for a loan of his place at Valence, and wrote to him to repair thither for the purpose of receiving the princes and of keeping them company so long as it might suit their convenience. Charles IV was only followed by the Prince of the Peace and one or two other Spaniards. In like manner, Messieurs de San Carlos and Esquikis were the only persons who did not desert the Prince of the Asturias. Monsieur del Infantado, Ceballos, and others remained at Bayonne and waited the arrival of the new king. 8 or 10 days elapsed between the departure of Charles IV and the Infantes and the arrival of King Joseph at Bayonne. During this interval of time, the emperor directed those military movements of his troops in Spain which he deemed calculated to maintain the public tranquility. He instructed Marshal Moncey to proceed to Valencia with one division and General Dupont to Andalusia with another. From the reports of the Grand Duke of Berg, who had dispatched officers to every point in Spain where our troops had not yet penetrated, and even to the Balearic Islands and to Ceuta on the coast of Africa, he thought he could rely on the friendly sentiments of General Castaños, as well as of the troops under the orders of this officer at the camp of St. Roch, opposite the fortress of Gibraltar. We paid dearly for the illusion to which the Grand Duke of Berg had allowed himself to yield. Marshal Bessières, who commanded at Burgos, was directed to check the Galician insurrection and to detach a body of troops towards Santander, where the bishop had placed himself at the head of the armed population. A small corps of troops was organized at Bayonne and marched upon Saragossa under the orders of General Lefebvre de Nouet. These different movements were taking place when King Joseph reached Bayonne. The emperor went out to meet him several leagues beyond the town, on which occasion I accompanied him. He made his brother step into his carriage and conducted him to the palace of Marat without stopping at the residence prepared at Bayonne for his reception. The Spaniards who were in that town, those of the suite of Charles IV, as well as of the Infantes, together with the deputies who had already reached Bayonne, had been apprised by the Minister for Foreign Affairs of the approach of the king to Maroc, and repaired to that residence an hour before the king's arrival. This prince had reluctantly quitted the kingdom of Naples, where he was beginning to derive enjoyment from the immense improvements he had made with it. The report of some of his administrative acts, which had spread in Spain, had created a favorable impression in the minds of the Spaniards. King Joseph's short reign in Naples, which gave it a new aspect, is so little known that a slight sketch of it will prove acceptable to my readers. At the time when King Ferdinand was filling the measure of his repeated violations of promises solemnly made, and giving admittance to the Anglo-Russian army into his dominions, 6 weeks had not elapsed since the ratification of a treaty of neutrality with France. On receipt of this intelligence, King Joseph was sent to take the command of an army destined to punish that unaccountable treachery by taking possession of the kingdom of Naples. On the approach of the French army, the English and Russian troops had retreated to Calabria, where they suffered many defeats, that of Campotenense in particular, which compelled them to re-embark. King Ferdinand had crossed over to Sicily and left his dominions at the mercy of the conqueror. Prince Joseph made his entry into Naples, where he was enthusiastically received. His first attention was bestowed upon the organization of the government. A portion of the French army under the command of Generals Saint-Cyr and Renier was sent into the Abruzzi, Apulia, Tarentum, and Calabria, and Marshal Massena was instructed to protect Naples and press the siege of Gaeta. After making these arrangements, Prince Joseph proceeded to inspect the different provinces, Calabria in particular, which was infested with robbers and inhabited by a population as wild as its mountains were inaccessible. He visited every village, entered into all the churches where the people crowded after him, and he was everywhere greeted with general acclamation. Finding himself under the necessity of postponing the expedition contemplated against Sicily, Prince Joseph continued his tour of inspection, inquired into the wants of the local administrations and into the complaints of the lower classes, took notes of everything on his way, caused plans to be drawn up for the construction of new roads, of bridges, and especially of a canal of communication between the two seas. This plan, which want of time prevented his carrying into effect, would have greatly contributed to the civilization of Calabria. Whilst engaged in these objects at the extremity of this province, he received the news of his elevation to the throne of Naples. He was greeted with fresh acclamations on his return to that capital. The wretched Neapolitans, who were a prey to anarchy and broken down by that spirit of revenge which had so frequently oppressed them by its terrors, raised their hands towards their liberator, and the first measures of the new king inspired them with the hope of a happy futurity. He began by creating a council of state to which he named those men whom the public voice pointed out as most deserving of confidence without any distinction of rank or party, and who zealously seconded his ardent endeavors towards effecting reforms and useful institutions. The feudal system, which kept the people in a state of servile dependence upon a few families and was upheld by superstitious feelings, was abolished with the consent of the nobles themselves, who lent their aid to this reform. They received an equivalent of their rights in proprietorship by notes payable out of the proceeds of the sale of national domains. The monastic orders were suppressed. The produce of the sale of their property supplies the exigencies of the public treasury and contributed to the endowment of colleges. Other establishments for public instruction, 3 celebrated abbeys, that of Monte Cassino among them, which contained valuable collections of manuscripts, and ancient charters were preserved, but the number of religious men was reduced to what was strictly requisite for the preservation of those archives. The Reformed monks, who were competent to instruct or to propagate the study of sciences, were disposed of in a manner suitable to the talents of each. Others were sent into the country to perform the duty of curates. Some were united into establishments formed upon the model of St. Bernard, for the purpose of attending to the safety of travelers in the mountains of Calabria and the Abruzzi, which are covered with snow during the greater part of the year. The monks, whom age and infirmities condemned to repose, were received and maintained in spacious establishments formed for that specific object. The people, and even the higher classes of society, were plunged in the deepest ignorance. The king's solicitude was attracted to public instruction. Fresh probationary schools were instituted, and primary ones for both sexes were soon seen springing up in every district. 30 establishments for gratuitous instruction were formed in different quarters of the city of Naples. Each province had a college and a boarding school for young girls. A central establishment was instituted at Aversa for the daughters of officers and public functionaries under the patronage of the Queen. At the end of every year, a competition was opened for giving admittance in that establishment to the most distinguished pupils of the provisional boarding schools. Professorships were restored in the different branches of belles lettres and sciences, which had long remained vacant. A royal academy was founded on the model of the French Institute. The 2 conservatories of music were united into one, which underwent a more perfect reorganization. The infamous practice of forming eunuchs was wholly abolished. The Academy of Painting received fresh encouragements. It numbered already 1,200 pupils. The excavations were encouraged at Pompeii and throughout the kingdom. The custom houses were removed to the frontiers. 2 manufactories of arms were established at different points of the Neapolitan dominions. The army and navy were organized upon an improved system. The recruiting in prisons was abolished. 4 tribunals were instituted for the purpose of effecting a jail delivery of the wretches who had filled the prisons during the several preceding years. The hospitals received large endowments of national property. A variety of taxes and contributions of every description established upon arbitrary and unequal basis were removed altogether and made way for a single territorial tax which produced a more equal distribution of the public burdens. A system of order and regularity began to prevail in the financial department. The public debt was partly paid off, and a sinking fund was created and made available to its eventual discharge. The money laid aside for the payment of the national debt was placed under the control of a commission appointed to watch over the national domains. This fund was augmented by the proceeds of the sale of the suppressed monastic institutions and of the immense plains of Apulia, which were the property of the crown. These plains had, in a very remote ages, been withdrawn from architectural purposes and destined for the pasturage of immense flocks of cattle, which were sent there every year from all parts of the kingdom. This system was detrimental to the cultivation of lands. It was accordingly abolished, and the public treasury, as well as agriculture in general, derived great benefit from this measure. The house, which had been inhabited by Tasso at Sorrentum, was repaired, and every edition of the works of this great poet was collected there under the custody of his more immediate descendant, to whom a pension was allowed by the state. That house was thereto inaccessible to visitors. A commodious road was made in order to facilitate the approach to it. The king bestowed his attention to the embellishment of the city of Naples. Special police regulations were adopted concerning it. Instead of being only lighted by a few lamps burning opposite to Madonnas, as heretofore, a general system of lighting by reflecting lamps was introduced. Its numerous population, softened down by a paternal government, renounced its habits of idleness and disorder and found means of exerting its activity. Workshops were constructed for the Lazzaroni. A spot was selected for establishing a village where employment was to be found for all those who were without any occupation in the city itself. And 2,000 of such persons were mustered into companies of workmen and employed on the public roads. 1/2 of the civil list, which was collected in notes upon mortgage states, was applied to the acquisition of national lands in the immediate vicinity of the king's principal residence, which he bestowed upon the officers of his army and court. Those donations had for object to inspire the Neapolitan nobility with a taste for the country life. When traveling through baronial lands, he encouraged the owners who often accompanied him on his journeys to repair their old dwelling houses to protect the country people and befriend the poor. He selected many large houses in parts the most distant from the capital for his residence during some months of the year, so as to enable him to judge of the progress of the institutions he had established. He gave audience to everyone, whether nobles, ministers, officers, or public functionaries, contrary to the custom of his predecessors, who confined themselves to a narrow circle of favorites. To the nobles he recommended that they should make themselves popular. To the people he enjoined a consideration for the landed proprietors, whom he represented to them as disposed to relinquish those rights and privileges which were alike injurious and degrading to their inferiors. To all classes of the community he endeavored to exhibit the French in the character of friends, who were concurring with him to relieve the country from the fetters which had kept its prosperity in check. He urged the necessity of justice and moderation, and brought the mildness of his personal conduct and the prudence of his character in aid of his precepts and recommendations. Carriage roads were opened or repaired, which ran from one extremity of the kingdom to the other. The only knowledge which the inhabitants had of a road in Calabria was from a tax levied for cutting it. Though never applied to that object, the road was completed, and the contribution abolished. The officers of the king's household who accompanied him on his journeys were entitled to certain duties raised upon their respective cities. These burdensome taxes were likewise abolished. During the short reign of King Joseph at Naples, he performed several journeys for purpose of general utility and of improvements upon which his mind was incessantly bent. After having driven the enemy from the kingdom, taken Gaeta, stifled the disturbances and insurrections which had repeatedly broke out in the Calabrias, and pacified those provinces by alternate measures of severity and indulgence, which were seconded by national guards placed under the orders of the principal landed proprietors. He brought back to Naples the knowledge he had acquired of the wants and wishes of the people confided to his care, which enabled him to give a fresh impulse to the labors of the administration and of the different sections of the council state. On his visit to the Abruzzi, he found the roads covered with a population actively engaged upon them, whose zeal in carrying his orders into effect was the sure earnest of their fully appreciating the advantage of those orders and of their desire to comply with the king's wishes. The old leaders of independent bands waited upon the king, who, so far from refusing the interview, held long conversations with him. He even employed several of those leaders and never had cause to repent this mark of confidence. Others brought over their partisans, whom he incorporated into regiments and who faithfully performed their duties. He always presided at the Council of State, and though vested with absolute power, he never decided but by the majority of votes. His fluency in the Italian language was of essential service in enabling him to demonstrate those theories of administration and government, the value of which was clearly proved by the example of France. All the improvements for which the kingdom of Naples was indebted to her new sovereign were obtained by means of persuasion and by a skillful amalgamation of the interests of all parties. Since his arrival in the country, he had raised the public revenue to double its previous amount. The debt, which was found at first to be 100 millions, was reduced to 50, and the resources adapted to extinction were firmly secured. All those germs of prosperity which were fully developed under his successor were already in progress when he was called away from Tubayan. These important results had established his character in the public opinion. The Spaniards expressed themselves satisfied at finding that the choice had fallen upon him to regenerate their country. "I have had the honor of being presented to the king, who arrived yesterday from Naples," said Ceballos in a confidential letter to his friend Azara. "And I think that his presence alone, his kindness of disposition, and the noble feelings which animate him, and which are manifest at first sight, will be sufficient to pacify the provinces without any necessity for recurring to arms." The Grand Inquisitor and all his attendants were unceasing in their protestations of fidelity and affection. They all expressed an ardent hope that King Joseph, being entrusted with the government of their country, would enjoy a happy reign and raise the nation to that degree of prosperity which was expected at his hands. The Duke del Infantado went still further. "We experienced the liveliest satisfaction," said he to King Joseph, "in the name of the Spanish grandees, in appearing before your majesties. Spaniards hope everything from your reign. Your majesty's presence is anxiously desired in Spain. It is especially wanting to fix all wavering ideas, to conciliate the interests of all, and bring back that state of order amongst us which is so indispensable for restoring our country to its former splendor. Sire, the grandees of Spain have long been celebrated for their fidelity to your sovereign. Your majesty will find in them the same fidelity and affection. Deign to receive our homage with that kindness which you have so often displayed to your Neapolitan subjects, and the fame of which has reached our ears. I am at a loss to account for the subsequent discontentment of the Duke del Infantado, but notwithstanding such strong protestations, he soon feigned to be overcome by tender scruples of conscience, and created fears in the minds of his fellow countrymen as to what was going to be required of them. The emperor was informed of this and was the more displeased at the change, because the duke's engagements towards him had led him to hope for a very different conduct. Had the Prince of the Peace been still at Bayonne, I might have supposed the change to have originated with him, but he had already left that town, and my suspicions lighted upon Senor Ceballos. The emperor was determined to read the Duke del Infantado a severe lecture. King Joseph had retired to the emperor's closet. The Duke del Infantado was introduced. I was present in the saloon with many of my comrades when the emperor addressed him in the following severe language. Is it your intention, sir, to trifle with or to brave me? Have you only remained here for the purpose of obstructing the adjustment of the affairs of your country instead of assisting me in that object which you told me it was your intention to promote with all the weight of your influence? Do you then take me for a madman? Do you suppose that I intend to have a king of Spain proclaimed by a handful of Spaniards in this place? You are indeed much deceived if you are not all aware, and you, sir, in particular, of the necessity of obtaining my protection in your own country. Do you not give me credit for knowing, as well as you do, that the courts alone are empowered to proclaim a king? But who can bring them together? Do you wish me to convoke them in this place? Could anything be more absurd? I desire to accompany the king to Madrid, and there enlighten your fellow countrymen respecting whatever you have witnessed and taken part in promoting. I rely upon the influence of knowledge, which is much greater in Spain than is generally supposed, for the eventual approbation and support of a measure founded upon rational policy. Your conduct is the more extraordinary as when I mention these circumstances to you and proposed to place you at the head of the administration in Spain, I observed that if the offer did not correspond with your wishes, I should not be hurt at your refusal. I made you the proposal of remaining in France for a couple of years. You are of a studious turn of mind. You may pass there the time which is requisite for consolidating a government in Spain. You replied in the negative. You had no objection to raise. You would even feel gratified at embarking in the public affairs of Spain. I might dispose of your services, and yet you are the first person I have to complain of. Nothing can be worse than the part you are acting. Be a candid friend or an open enemy. I do not detain you here. You may ask for a passport and proclaim to join the insurgents. I shall not be offended at it, but if you remain, you must conduct yourself properly. For otherwise, depend on it, you shall not escape me. The Duke del Infantado was greatly at a loss for reply. He protested against the calumnious imputations leveled at him and renewed the assurance of his readiness strictly to abide by his engagements. The emperor suffered himself to be appeased, having spoken in such strong terms, in order not to be under the necessity of recurring to the subject either with the Duke del Infantado or with any other Spaniard. When the first burst of anger had blown over, the emperor conversed as if nothing had taken place. He sent for King Joseph, who was immediately acknowledged as King of Spain by the Duke del Infantado and the Spanish ministers who were introduced to his presence and with whom he conversed for a few moments. Curiosity made me retire with them with the audience chamber in order to hear what might be said in the adjoining apartment where all the Spanish deputies were waiting to be presented. I approached the door and was the first to retire as soon as it was opened for the ministers upon their taking leave of the king. The utmost curiosity was manifested by those who had remained in the anteroom and who were incessant in their questions. I heard Senor Savary say in French, none but the most fastidious could object to a king whose mildness bespeaks so much in his favor. There is no danger of his failing in Spain, and the sooner he makes his appearance there, the better. These expressions of Savarios, uttered in my presence, appeared to be the stamp to his political faith, and I was therefore much astonished on reading the pamphlet which he published in less than a month from that time. The deputies were introduced into the audience chamber soon after the minister had left it. The king spoke to each deputy, and they all appeared well satisfied with their reception. It was late when they returned to Bayonne. On the very next day, those Spaniards who held court employments a week before near the persons of Charles IV and the two infants began to perform the same honorable duties near King Joseph. The Spanish notables whom the emperor had convoked had for the greater part arrived at Bayonne, they were directed to discuss the Constitutional Act. The principal clauses of the project were as liberal and proper as could possibly be desired. The public treasury and civil list were kept distinct from each other. The basis of the legislative power were determined, the attributions of the executive authority especially defined, the independence of the judges, the liberty of every citizen, and the freedom of the press irrevocably fixed. The propagation of liberal ideas, the improvements which were to contribute to the progress of agriculture, of manufactures, of sciences, arts, industry, commerce, everything, in short, that was calculated to secure the prosperity of Spain was solemnly sanctioned. The notables hailed this project of a constitution with expressions of gratitude. They made those alterations in it which local customs rendered necessary, and declared satisfaction they felt at finding their rights now guaranteed to them. Everything went on well, and the most flattering anticipations were entertained in respects to the future. Chapter 26. It has just been seen how prosperously everything went on at Bayonne. The case was otherwise in Spain, and to add to our disappointments, the Grand Duke of Berg was attacked with serious illness, which made it impossible for him to attend to public business. The Emperor was desirous to wait the arrival of the old regiments, which he had ordered to ban previously to sending the king forward, because they were to form a corps of reserve, which would garrison the city of Madrid and be an escort to the king. These regiments, to the number of 6, were a part of those who had returned to France after the Peace of Tilsit. Nevertheless, as some person was immediately wanted to supply the place of the Grand Duke of Berg, and the Emperor had no opportunity for making a selection at Bayonne, he directed me to proceed to Madrid, where I found myself in a more extraordinary situation than any general officer had ever been placed in. My mission was for the purpose of perusing all the reports addressed to the Grand Duke of Berg, to return answers and issue orders in every case of emergency, but I was not to fix my signature to any paper. Everything was to be done in the name of General Belliard, in his capacity as Chief of Staff of the Army. The Emperor adopted this course because he intended to send the king forward in a very short time, and felt it to be unnecessary to make any alteration until the king's arrival in Madrid, when I was to be recalled. He gave me some verbal instructions at the moment of my departure. The substance of them was that I was to use every endeavor to calm the public mind, and he added that I should do myself great credit by putting a stop to all disorders. He enjoined me not to lose a moment in restoring an open communication between Madrid and General Dupont, who had been sent to Andalusia, and for the last 3 weeks past had not been heard of. The main object at this moment, he said, is to occupy many different points of the country in order to spread amongst the Spaniards those ideas which it is desirable to engraft on their minds. But it requires great prudence and moderation, and the strictest discipline to avoid the dangers attendant upon dispersing the troops over a vast extent of country. Above all things, you should strictly forbid plunder. I have yet no intelligence of the part adopted by General Castaños, who commands the camp at St. Roque. The Grand Duke certainly informs me of the general having written to him, and he is very sanguine in consequence. But you know how prone he is to place reliance on whatever said to him. You must not undertake any operation for which your disposable forces are inadequate. As to reinforcements, you know the present position of the troops I might send to your assistance. Do not therefore place yourself under the necessity of requiring them before they can possibly come up. Endeavor to await the king's arrival. Spread the report of his departure, which I am going to accelerate, and then leave the Spaniards to act. Be a mere spectator among them. Neglect no means, however, of securing a regular and rapid system of communication. This is a matter of the highest importance. Whether the insurrection should extend any farther or be checked in its progress, the first of all objects is to obtain correct information. I took my departure, though with some reluctance, at being compelled to return to Spain, because I anticipated no favorable result from the course of events in that country, and have always felt a repugnance to interfere in any internal commotions, even when my own political interests should have encouraged me to such interference. I arrived at Madrid, where I saw uneasiness pictured on the countenance of Spaniards as well as Frenchmen, and one of the greatest obstacles I had to encounter was in the difficulties I experienced in endeavoring to revive the drooping spirits of all. The Grand Duke of Berg returned to France a few days after my arrival with a crowd of young men who accompanied him for the purpose of soliciting favors and promotions. They had been rendered so difficult to please that they could not be made to follow the military pursuit with any degree of constancy. They reveled in the pleasures and even the dangers of a soldier's life, but dreaded the hardships of it. I had been ordered to take up my quarters in the Palace of Madrid because all the military establishments were in its immediate vicinity and the troops were on their guard ever since the affair of the 2nd of May. The staff of the army was also stationed there from the motives of precaution, so that everyone was at hand and within call. I adopted farther measures of precaution and fortified the old palace of the Retiro, where I caused an entrenchment to be raised round the porcelain manufactory from which I turned out every workman. I collected within this enclosure all the warlike stores, as well as the provisions of the army, every person employed in the military administration, the generals, the depots of soldiers, and left, in short, in the barracks no other troops than those which could run to arms and march in any direction at a moment's notice. I forbade that any other officer should be quartered anywhere else than with his soldiers, even if he were compelled to occupy the same room with them. I found on my arrival at Madrid that no news had been received from General Dupont since he had reached Cordova. We were therefore in total ignorance of his position. I ordered General Vidal to join him with his division, which was stationed at Toledo, made him follow the road taken by General Dupont, and profited of the occasion to inform General Dupont of what had taken place at Bayonne and of the aspect of affairs throughout Spain. I told him that his position in Andalusia was no longer in harmony with the existing state of things, which had greatly altered since his departure to occupy that province, that the Emperor had certainly ordered I should leave him there, because he was still under the impression that the Spanish corps under General Castaños at the camp of St. Roque would form a junction with him, since he had set it down to me as part of the troops that would be found under his Dupont's orders. But that if I was to rely upon the prevailing reports, the corps of Castaños had actually joined the insurgents, I should wait, however, for his report previously to adopt any determination. Vidal's division began its movement in advance and reached General Dupont after 7 or 8 days' march. Marshal Moncey, who had been sent to Valencia with a single division and was forced to penetrate through a wretched road in the mountains of Quinza, had not even been mentioned since his departure. Not a word of news had been received from him. I ordered a division to advance under the command of General Frere for the purpose of opening a communication with him, as I was wholly ignorant of the point at which Marshal Moncey would drop. I could only direct Frere's division to follow the road he had taken. I learned through this general that the attack upon Valencia had failed of success, and that Marshal Moncey was retreating through Albacete. On receiving this report, I sent Frere's division to Saint Clemente, where it overtook Marshal Moncey. Whilst my attention was directed to the 2 points occupied by Marshal Moncey and General Dupont, Marshal Bessières, who was at Burgos, informed me that the Spanish General Cuesta, who was Captain General of Castile or Extremadura, had thrown off the mask and was marching against us, that he, Bessières, had in consequence collected his corps and was moving towards Rio Seco. He urged me to send troops to his assistance. I accordingly dispatched a brigade of infantry with 4 pieces of cannon and 300 cavalry, who joined him after the victory which he gained at Rio Seco over combined Spanish troops and insurgent forces. I was also applied to from Saragossa for reinforcements, and the Emperor, moreover, after sending orders from Bayonne to Verdier's division at Vitoria to march upon Saragossa, wrote to me desiring I should place myself in communications with the corps at Saragossa by stationing some troops at Calahorra and Calatiyud. The communications between Madrid and Bayonne were becoming obstructed and even irregular, so that when the reply came to any letter, the state of the question at issue was no longer the same. I clearly saw from the tenor of the emperor's letters that he was completely mistaken in respect to our position, and I resolved to act upon my own judgment. I declined sending any troops to open a communication with Saragossa. The French were blockading it, and it was perfectly indifferent to me whether or not I received any account of the siege. If the Spaniards had defeated them, they had an open country in their rear, and it was quite out of my power to afford them any assistance. I sent orders to Marshal Moncey to attend to no other object than to give rest to his troops and to keep up a constant communication with me only. I secured my own communications with beyond the risk of interruption and waited in this situation for news from General Dupont. My impatience on this subject had rendered me indifferent to every other. They at last came to hand. General Vidal had opened a communication with him and sent me letters from General Dupont himself, who informed me that, after proceeding as far as Cordova, he had been compelled to retreat to Andújar, where he preserved a tete de pont on the Guadalquivir. He gave me an account of the insurrection in Andalusia and the part taken in it by the corps of General Castaños, who had quitted its encampment within the lines of St. Roch and was then in front of him. The war was assuming in that part of the country a character which it was highly important to change by an early and decisive success, instead of which we experienced a most disastrous defeat. I had intimated to the emperor, notwithstanding his instructions, I should take upon myself to withdraw the corps from Andalusia, as I apprehended it would be out of my power to afford it any assistance. He replied that I was in error, that I ought to leave it in that province and firmly establish my communication with Andújar so as to recall it at a moment's notice. Notwithstanding the emperor's order, I still persisted in my opinion, and whilst I apprised General Dupont that the emperor directed me to leave him in Andalusia until the very last extremity, I took upon myself to desire he would immediately evacuate that province, recross the mountains, and establish his corps in the province of La Mancha. I urged him not to suffer himself to be led astray by the pride of an obstinacy which might be attended with the most fatal consequences, and I used this expression in writing to him. Above all things, be on your guard against a misfortune, the result of which it is impossible to foresee. My letter was delivered by Vidal to General Dupont, who acknowledged its receipt, and I sent the emperor a copy of both. He persisted in his determination to remain in Andalusia, observing that he should have nothing to fear from the troops of Castaños so soon as he should have collected his scattered forces. When this letter came to my hands, matters had taken a more unfavorable turn on the other points of Spain, and the apprehensions I felt for his safety were considerably increased. I resolved to send off a third division, that of General Joubert, to which I added the only brigade of cuirassiers we had in Spain, in order to take up a position at Manzanares in La Mancha and open a communication with General Vidal. I also handed to him a letter he was to forward to General Dupont, whom I therein apprised of my sending Joubert's division to protect his retreat, which I foresaw to be unavoidable, but by no means to assist in any offensive operations in front, which I strictly forbade him to attempt, and I told him accordingly that he was not at liberty to call that division to join him unless the safety of the two divisions which he had under his orders should be endangered. I directed General Joubert at the same time to inform me of every order he might receive from General Dupont. As soon as he had reached the line of communication for General Vidal, he sent my dispatch to General Dupont, whose only reply was an order to General Joubert to cross the Sierra Morena and form a junction with him. General Joubert gave me intimation of this order. It threw me into a state of agitation I am at a loss to explain, and which was only allayed by the confidence I entertained in the prudence and talents of General Dupont. Nevertheless, I was unable to resist the gloomy forebodings to which my mind was a prey. I rose up in the night to write a few lines to that general, desiring him in the most forcible language to recross the Sierra Morena with his 3 divisions and put himself in communication with me as soon as possible. I requested General Billiard to send this letter off immediately by an officer of his staff with a proper escort, so that there might be no doubt of his safe arrival. Monsieur de Fenelon was the officer entrusted with this mission. Chapter 27. The unfortunate occurrences which occasioned the failure of the Emperor's enterprise upon Spain date from this moment, and they require to be stated in detail. Monsieur de Fenelon was taken prisoner in Andalusia, and he was descending the Sierra Morena. His dispatches were carried to General Castaños at the moment he was compelling the plenipotentiaries of General Dupont to consider the first and most disgraceful transaction that he has ever tarnished the glory of our arms. This unfortunate occurrence had been brought about in the following manner. General Dupont was at Andujar with one of his divisions, General Barbuz, I believe, and had a strong detachment at Menjibar on the Guadalquivir, a few leagues above Andujar. He accordingly protected the Tête du Pont of Andujar whilst he was watching the ferry of Menjibar, where the Guadalquivir is usually crossed. He had ordered Videl's division to Belen on the road from the Sierra Morena to Andujar at the distance of 4 leagues from the latter town, and the division of General Joubert to La Carolina 4 leagues in the rear of it, so that the 3 divisions, being at the distance of only a few leagues from each other, might, in case of need, be brought together in the course of the day. It was in the middle of June, and the heat was excessive, particularly in Andalusia. The Spaniards advanced to attack the Tête du Pont at Andujar on the 14th and 15th of June and crossed the river at Menjibar in small numbers. General Dupont sent orders to General Vidal, who was stationed at Belen, to oppose the passage at Menjibar, from whence he was withdrawing the troops he had posted there, as he stood in need of them at Andujar, where an attack was made upon him, and he ordered at the same time Joubert's division to advance from La Carolina to Belen, which had just been left by General Videl's division. This movement was correctly executed. The first attack of the Spaniards was undeserving of attention, but it was renewed on the following day and threatened more serious consequences. General Dupont ordered to Andujar Videl's division, which he had sent to Belen and Menjibar on the preceding day, and it was under the necessity of moving off at the moment when the Spaniards were manifesting the intention to cross the river. Vidal fortunately left there a brigade under General Belair, who called General Joubert to his assistance. General Dupont had directed Joubert's division, which was at Belen, to replace Vidal at Menjibar. General Joubert found that the enemy were already on the right bank of Guadalquivir, determined to charge them at the head of a squadron of cuirassiers, and was killed in this trifling affray by overexposing his person. This event, which would have been very unimportant at any other time, proved a fatal consequence on the present occasion. He was replaced in the command of his division by the General Brigade Dufour, who was at the head of the column of infantry at some distance in the rear. When the news was brought to him that it fell to his turn to command the division, this general was no doubt ignorant of the movements that were to be carried into effect, as well as of the instructions given to General Joubert, so that he was led astray by all the reports brought to him, and by the one amongst the others which informed him that the enemy had turned his left, an absurd supposition, since there was nothing more than a small ferry at Menjibar, which is quite inadequate for the purpose of conveying across the number of troops requisite for such an operation. It was not even attempted by the Spanish division stationed at Menjibar under the orders of the Swiss General Renning. And had General Dufour pushed on as far as Menjibar, he would have immediately ascertained whether or not any troops had crossed over to the right bank. Deceived by this report, General Dufour set off with his division, abandoned the idea of approaching the river, and proceeded to meet the enemy, whom he supposed to have turned his left. He took the road back to Belen, at which place he was informed, as he said, that they had made their appearance at Linares, on their march towards the mountains with the intentions, no doubt, of intercepting the communication with Madrid. On receiving this fresh report, he advanced from Belen to La Carolina, taking the precaution to apprise General Dupont of his movement and of his motive for resorting to it. The latter not only approved of it according to Dufour's account, but sent immediately Videl's division to Belen for the purpose of supporting General Dufour, whom he actually supposed to be in advance of him, and assuredly not running after a shadow which could not have deceived a mere captain of horse chasseurs.